Now, I think it would be natural to go on to talk about Rhinoa or Laguna next, because they are obviously equally significant protagonists in this game. But instead of that, I want to talk about Seifer, because, as I briefly mentioned, Seifer shares a very symbiotic relationship with Squall, but he's also almost universally overlooked and laughed at for being a sort of weak loser with this sort of dream of his. But I think Seifer plays a very important role, and one of the most formative feuds of the game is between Squall and Seifer, and there's a very significant sort of yin and yang thing going on between these two, a binary opposition, and yet an intrinsic coexistence that propels them both forward through this sort of antagonism. And again, this sort of yin yang thing we can see characterized all the way down to aesthetics and attitude. Where Squall dresses in black, Seifer dresses in white, so quite literally, sort of mimicking a yin and yang. And again, like the elements that I mentioned earlier, the colours are loaded with a symbolism, particularly if we consider this game from a Japanese perspective, which is of course, the perspective that it was constructed in. I mean, in the West, the colour white has always been taken to mean good, and black has always been taken to mean bad. But in Japan, it's sort of the other way round. The highest belt you can achieve in karate, for example, is black, and this signifies being learned, wisdom and strength. White, on the other hand, is the first belt that you have in karate, and this symbolises being a beginner and conveys a certain naivety. And these are traits that I think we can certainly see in the personalities of Squall and Seifer. Seifer also takes on an overtly European look, and he has very Bond features, and his coat, for example, is covered in European Crusader iconography, the white and red. And true enough, he does also aspire to be Adia's knight, so there's a very European and chivalric sense of loyalty about Seifer. It's almost coincidental that he just happens to be fighting for the wrong side. If we look at Square, digressing on this point, if we look at Square and their reputation for portraying Christianity as an antagonist, for example, in the guise of Yevon in Final Fantasy X, and Sephiroth, his final form at the end of Final Fantasy VII, he's very overtly an Abrahamic seraphim angel at the end of 7. We can strongly assume that the Christian iconography for Seifer as antagonist again is deliberate too. I'd just like to digress a little further on Seifer, particularly the Sorceress Knight thing, because I just find this little aspect of the game brilliant, and I didn't actually realise it until a couple of years ago. But Seifer's dream to be a knight stems from a movie that he saw once, and if you cast your mind back and remember a short dream sequence on disc 3, there's a scene where Laguna is starring in a movie and a ruby dragon shows up. And basically in this scene, Laguna has a gunblade and he's holding it how Seifer does, and he strikes a remarkably similar sort of victory pose as Seifer as well. So I think it's strongly indicated that Laguna was in fact the star of the movie, the Sorceress Knight movie, which Seifer saw and became obsessed with when he was a little boy. And I think this is an interesting subtlety to the game, and also funny, because if you think about it, it means that Seifer was obsessed with Squall's dad, but also it ties Seifer in closer to the game's main events than we originally may have thought. There's this sort of fated circle of characters whose destinies are all intertwined and sort of touched by Laguna. And it means that Seifer isn't really just this annoying guy on the periphery of the main action, but he's actually in there and inherently a part of this whole story arc. Now, Seifer is introduced to us as a mean-spirited and generally quite a bully with a thoroughly kind of Machiavellian streak about him. But it's important that we understand this is not the real Seifer. Again, like the Orphans, it's a coping mechanism employed because inside, the real Seifer, just like the others, is sort of scared. He's just this shit-scared sort of orphan, Where the others actually reconcile themselves to reality, however, Seifer goes on to pursue the facade, the constructed persona of the Sorceress's Knight. And this is only bolstered by the fact that, in my opinion, Seifer remembers and knows full well that Adia is matron. I think it's worth digressing into this point, actually, because one thing I've noticed about Seifer is that he seems to hang on to remnants of the past that others don't. So, for example, his hatred of Squall being the main one, but also, his ongoing bullying of Zell. He calls him Chickenwas all the time, which is evidenced both in his childhood flashbacks and the contemporary events of the game. So it's led me to believe that Seifer remembers the past just like Irvine does. And on a recent playthrough, I noticed at the end of Disc 2, just before you fight Adia for the final time, Seifer actually confronts Squall and says, "You want to fight Matron after all she's done for us." Now, of course, this revelation comes to the party during the basketball scene, but Seifer wasn't actually there, so I think we can assume that Seifer draws his own conclusions from his own memories about who the sorceress is. And I think, this is bolstered again by the fact he never graduated and became a seed, so perhaps he doesn't use Guardian forces, and, his memories have remained intact to this end. A final note I want to make on Seifer, because I know I've spoken about him quite a lot, but the events of the ending animation, we see his redemption and reconciliation with the world and his friends, and this was like one of my favourite parts of the ending. Like Squall, Seifer has spent his life and the duration of the game contending a profound inner turmoil, and I just found it great that instead of killing him off or something like that, they showed him fishing with Raijin and Fujin, and it's prudent, I think, that, with this whole fated symbiosis between him and Squall, not only does Squall smile for the first time in the ending FMV, but so too does Seifer smile for the first time in the ending FMV. So it's just this great kind of conciliation and conclusion for both of these characters, by the end of the game, I think.